The hull was vast and more cathedral than courtroom. Its walls stretched into the dark sky above, formed from obsidian-like alloys mined from dead stars. Across the circular chamber sat the most feared and powerful beings in the known galaxy, delegates from every council species, draped in ceremonial armor, surrounded by translator drones, escorted by warriors spread not for war, but for intimidation. This was the center of galactic law, and in the middle of it, entirely alone, stood a human. He didn't kneel. He didn't flinch. He stood like a fracture in the polished floor, imperfect, unwanted, and unafraid. A hush had fallen when the human entered, not because of who he was, but because of what Earth now represented. The charge was clear. Earth had been accused of cultural contamination, of spreading ideas that disrupted galactic order, civil unrest on trade moons, uprisings among vassal planets, a refusing central override, and at the heart of all of Ida Earth's philosophy, a virus, they called it, a corruption of structure, loyalty, and obedience. But what frightened the Council wasn't Earth's military, and no species had laughed harder when Earth sent signals of peace. What frightened them was that Earth had won minds, not wars, that its ideas had reached places their weapons couldn't. And so, this trial wasn't for justice, it was for silence. The presiding Archon, a translucent being with a flowing neural halo, leaned forward, voice booming like collapsing gravity. Human designation Aidan Veras. Earth stands accused of intellectual insurrection. You are permitted a final declaration before judgment is enforced. The room pulsed with anticipation. The crowd expected pleas, perhaps arrogance, maybe even threats. But Aidan said nothing at first. He raised his head, scanning the alien faces. He didn't see monsters. He saw fear. Not of humans but of change. And then he spoke, just one word. Not shouted, not whispered, but delivered with absolute conviction. The translator drones froze. The audio channels glitched. The neural relays flickered. It wasn't a command. It wasn't a curse. It was a concept, wrapped in sound, a word so deeply human it didn't translate cleanly. The closest equivalent was remember. But it carried more than memory. It carried pain, pride, defiance, history, loss, rebellion. It carried the scream of a dying mother shielding her child, the resolve of a father who gave up freedom for truth, the promise of a rebel who never saw the sunrise but still believed others would. The chamber fell into stunned silence. Delegates began to blink, then twitch. One clawed ambassador growled, unable to define the emotion he suddenly felt. Another, usually stoic and expressionless, let out a low tremble like the first time a prisoner tastes hope. The sound of the word wasn't dangerous. It was what it did to the soul. It unlocked something ancient, something most species had buried to survive under the Council's rule. Aidan didn't speak again. He let the word echo. Across the room, a young representative from a subjugated planet lowered her head and quietly repeated the word in her own language. Her guards moved to silence here but paused. They'd heard it too. The Archon stammered. What a broken bar was that? It wasn't fear in his voice, it was disbelief. For a moment, he was something no council leader had been in centuries, uncertain. Aidan smiled faintly, and not in mockery, but in understanding. It's not the word, he said quietly, it's what it reminds you of. That's when the council realized their greatest weapon, a controller, had just been cracked. Not shattered, not overthrown, but cracked. And a single crack is where revolutions begin. The council chamber erupted in disarray. Delegates demanded emergency translation audits. Others shouted for neural scramblers. Several simply stood, too stunned to process what they were feeling. And Aidan, he remained still, the weight of 1,000 silent rebellions pressing through his presence. Security approached. He didn't resist. He didn't run. He simply said, "You can imprison me." But not the word, because by then, it had already spread. The neural feeds that echoed his voice were hacked and rebroadcast by sympathetic techs on fringe worlds. Rogue satellites picked up the frequency and looped it. Across systems began whispering it in sleep mode cycles. Refugees painted it on broken walls. Rebellion didn't look like an army. It looked like meaning rediscovered. And while the council scrambled to understand the breach, they didn't notice what was already forming beneath the surface. Not warships, not invasions, a movement. Because when a word plants itself in the hearts of billions, and reminds them of something they forgot they once had, a dignity, memory, Choicea, it's no longer a sound, it's a fuse, and it had just been lit, which is why, as they dragged Adan from the chamber, and the Council's emergency protocols began to fire across the stars, the silent wave had already begun to ripple across sectors they thought were loyal. They didn't yet know what had started, but they would learn, because now came the moment where the spark turned into flame, and that's when the retaliation would begin. The Council's chambers had not known chaos in centuries, not like this. Delegates scrambled, comm links burst with static, guards pressed encrypted panic codes into neural pads, and protocol I stammered in corrupted loops. But none of that mattered because the damage was already done. The word had left Adan Veris's lips, and in that moment, protocol itself became meaningless. It wasn't just a political violation, it was a philosophical detonation, a disruption not of law, but of identity. The emergency containment teams encased Adan in a pulse field, a crackling dome of translucent static. But the moment his mouth closed, the echo of that word didn't fade, it seemed to deepen, as if the Council chamber itself was replaying it, testing it, trying to understand what had just entered its bloodstream. It wasn't just sound. That word, I remember, had skipped the logic course of translator drones and gone straight into the limbic systems of anyone who heard it. Delegates who had evolved with entirely different sensory systems, delegates without ears or traditional hearing, reported feeling the word in their bones, their membranes, their hive consciousnesses. It triggered buried thoughts, painful awakenings, not facts about truths, forgotten, locked away, or erased truths that had waited too long to be spoken again. Emergency protocols activated, neurodampeners deployed from ceiling panels, purging emotional overload. Light patterns shifted to dull grays to suppress agitation. Drone reinforcements moved in. But something far more dangerous was already spreading, a confusion. For the first time in remembered history, the Galactic Council did not know what to do. One by one, the languages of rebellion began to fracture into the air. Not in noisy but in posture, in glances, in silence. Delegates from border worlds exchanged looks, not of defiance but of memory, of something they had once lost, and now couldn't unhear. The symbolic power of that word began unfolding in layers, some cultural, others ancestral. The tech races saw it as data corruption. The biologicals felt it as instinct. The hybrids experienced it as a resyncing of forgotten purpose. And still, no one understood how. Why had one word uttered without threat, without weapon, been enough to split the mind of a galactic civilization? Because it wasn't just a word, it was Earth. It was the entire species boiled into a sound. A species that had learned to crawl through fire, to rebuild from ash, to forgive without forgetting, to fight without ever claiming to be the strongest. A species that carried trauma not as a scar, but as a badge. A history not as a weapon, but as a lesson. That word was all of that, remember. And deep within the Council's core systems, beyond the soundproofed walls and behind surveillance, a bigger problem surfaced. The Central Lexicon Archive, an ancient database of all known language inputs, flagged the word as non-categorizable. It had no matching origin, no predictable impact. It could not be redacted. Every time it was entered, the system paused, not because of a glitch, but because it required context to process, something no algorithm could provide, only experience. So the machines fell silent, the bureaucracy collapsed under the weight of meaning. And in 1,000 places far from the Council's walls, where translators had picked up the neural transmission, something began to change. On the mining moons of Altura Prime, where laborers worked under conditions barely distinguishable from slavery, the word was painted onto walls in glowing mineral ink. On the water world of Thessari, the priest cast a long silence by the Empire's rulers repeated it in their prayers, once outlawed, now reborn. And in the underground code spirals of rogue collectives, it was already being weaponized, and not to harm, but to awaken. Still, the Council tried to act. The Archon demanded a full lockdown on Earth origin signals. Drones moved to erase memory traces. The press was muzzled. The delegates were detained for debrief, and Earth was declared in violation of Interstellar Code Sigma, intellectual insurgency. But there was no undoing what had been spoken. The word was not a weapon in the traditional sense. It carried no kill code, No virus, no blast radius, but it carried something far worse in the eyes of the Council, meaning the system couldn't control. And Aidan Veras, as they held him in containment aboard a Council cruiser orbiting the neutral moon, he didn't resist the neural scans. He didn't flinch as they replayed his speech. He only smiled on Sia when a junior technician paused, hand hovering above the command interface, tears brimming in eyes he didn't know could cry. "What a broken bar was that?" the tech whispered. "It's who we are," Aidan said. "It's what they were afraid we'd remember." By the time the cruiser transmitted that footage back to the Council for review, the damage was irreversible. Because a word once spoken cannot be unspoken. Because a soul once awakened cannot go back to sleep. And because the next phase had already begun, not through war fleets or diplomatic ultimatums, but through whispers, graffiti, vibrations in the ether. It was in the silence between laws, in the pause between orders, in the hesitation of an officer's finger before pulling a trigger. And that hesitation, that was where Earth would win. Now came the reaction, the first sparks of rebellion, the first fractured command, the first weapon lowered instead of fired, because the word had shattered protocol, and in its place a broken bar came the ripple of revolution. In the silent dark between stars, messages move faster than ships. Words don't need warp drives, they only need ears. And by the time the Council completed its emergency lockdown, the word had already spread like static through a thunderstorm, erratic, impossible to trace, and everywhere all at once. No one admitted to broadcasting it. No central node could be blamed. It wasn't a hack, it was an echo. It leaked into dreams, into security logs, into the background hum of shipboard I, in dormitories and freight depots and underground archaeology systems. That single human word didn't appear as a translation, it appeared as feeling. Memory wrapped in vibration. Across 100 worlds, thousands of species paused mid-task, mid-breath, mid-sentence, and turned towards something no one could explain because it wasn't logic, it was truth. On the cobalt mines of Varax 2, hardened exosuited workers stopped drilling. A silence fell. A foreman turned off his comm link, tears streaming silently behind a metal visor. He didn't understand the word language, but he understood it in grief, in loss, in sacrifice. And somewhere deep in the lower levels, someone had carved it onto steel. Remember, on the academic rings orbiting KLN Prime, students interrupted a Council history seminar to ask their professors, "Why does this word a broken bar feel like we've forgotten something we once swore we never would?" On the slave markets of the outer neutral colonies, a synthetic child built to entertain refused to obey a command for the first time. When asked why, she simply said, "I remember." It wasn't rebellion, not yet, it was recognition. The Council watched the fallout in real time and found themselves unprepared. They had protocols for biological outbreaks, they had tactical fail-safes for psychic unrest, but a moral uprising, a linguistic virus that touched the heart, not the system, there was no firewall for that. Inside Council archives, the Prime historians activated black site files. Emergency doctrines long believed obsolete. They reviewed the last documented emotional contagions, ancient rebellions from long-erased civilizations, uprisings born not from injustice alone, but from awareness. These were the moments the Council had buried, rewritten, sterilized. Now they were back, resurrected by one word that Earth had dared to speak. Delegates began requesting relocation. Some quietly removed insignias from their robes. Council enforcers noticed an alarming drop in loyalty compliance among low-rank field agents. And at the fringe of civilized space, entire fleets went silent and not destroyed, not jammed, just a broken bar off-grid. Listening, they weren't preparing for war, they were pausing to feel. Back aboard his prison ship, Aidan Veras remained in silence. His lips were sealed, his message had already traveled farther than any voice could carry, and he knew this wasn't the end of anything, it was only the tremor before the quake. A technician on his security team defected that night, stealing a copy of the transmission and sending it through a blind relay into the gravity well of the Andromex. Uprising, a rebellion thought crashed a century ago. By morning, 3 fringe colonies declared neutrality from the Council and adopted the word as their sigil. They didn't ask Earth's permission. They simply felt seen. It had nothing to do with species, nothing to do with culture. It had everything to do with silencia and the decision to break it. The Council scrambled to issue counter-propaganda. Their voice modules repeated mantras of order, balance, unity. But their messages fell flat, because when people have tested meaning, structure feels like chains, and Earth's message wasn't a demand for war. It was an invitation to remember who they were before the Council told them who to be. The ripple became a wave. In the diplomatic towers of Veltrax 6, a translator bot working for the ambassador's office refused to erase the word from its database. It instead programmed itself to repeat it every hour, whispering softly into data channels, "Remember, remember." One by one, old revolutionary groups came out of hiding, not with guns, with music, with paintings, with fragments of culture the Council had long outlawed. Murals appeared on superstructure walls. Monuments once removed were rebuilt in secrecy. Libraries once burned began reappearing in digital fragments anchored by a single word in every opening page. This shockwave had become a reverberation, each echo stronger than the last. The Council considered martial action, but it was too late for force. You can shoot the body, you can erase a signal, but you cannot kill meaning once it has found a place to live. And now, that place was everywhere. Still, they tried. Censorship bills were passed. Orbital broadcast zones were purged. Arrests made. Earth was declared in full violation of Galactic Article 0, the crime of ideological contamination. The Council's war drums began to thunder, but even as they mobilized fleets and droughted sanctions, something in their cadence faltered. Because on every world they ruled, in every species they monitored, there was now hesitation. The word had caused more than chaos. It had caused memory, and memory was where identity lived. The Council hadn't just lost control of Earth. They were beginning to lose control of themselves. Which is why, when the first suppressor fleet was sent to Earth's orbit, something unusual happened. The commanding officer paused before giving the order to strike. He looked at the signal logs. The Council's declaration, a broken bar and the last image received from Earth, a school of children, drawing that word on a wall. He turned off his comms, and Earth remained untouched, because the word had spread, and the next move, now a broken bar, wouldn't be Earth's. It would be from the galaxy itself. It was supposed to be easy. Earth was primitive by galactic standards, and no planet-wide defense grid, no standing orbital fleet, no antimatter cannons to repel Council enforcers. They expected fear, compliance, a swift kneel to the authority of the stars. But when the first wave of suppression drones entered Earth's exosphere, what they found wasn't resistancia, it was silence. Not the silence of submission, the silence of resolve. Cities still bustled. Networks stayed live. Earth didn't black out or run. It simply waited, but not passively. Human networks had already begun to sink beyond global jurisdictions. Underground cooperatives abandoned borders. Independent satellites redirected themselves into relay stations. Artists projected the word "remember" in lights across skyscrapers and orbital towers. The entire planet had become one unified act of defiance, not through arms but through identity. It wasn't about protecting territory. It was about protecting truth. The Council's High Command authorized the Tier 2 orbital intimidation maneuver. A ring of destroyers formed a halo around the planet, shining down warning beams across continents. Submit or be pacified. Their translation drones declared in every human language. The message echoed for 3 hours. Earth never replied, but their silence was deafening. On the ground, people held hands in city squares. Old rivals stood shoulder to shoulder. Entire continents moved like one mind, united not by a single leader but by a single memory. This wasn't just a geopolitical stancia, it was spiritual, emotional, human. It was the refusal of a species to surrender the very thing that made it dangerous to empires. Its belief that even the smallest voice could ripple across galaxies. The Council miscalculated. When they sent envoys to speak with Earth's representatives, they were shocked to find no centralized authority demanding terms, no presidents, no generals, no supreme voices, just crowds, civilian assemblies, public neural nets broadcasting their consensus to the stars. One envoy said, "Who speaks for Earth?" And the reply came, not from Onia but from billions. We do. It was a message that confused the Council's hierarchy-driven systems. A species without the central leader was a system they couldn't negotiate with or control. It defied every protocol. It exposed the flaw in their dominance. They ruled through pressure applied to pyramids of power. But Earth was a circle now, and you cannot topple a circle. As the Council's diplomats returned in frustration, surveillance picked up another anomaly. Higher-ranking soldiers in the orbital fleet had begun disabling their own weapons systems. It wasn't sabotage, it was conscience. Many of them had heard the word. Some had family on hybrid colonies influenced by Earth's philosophy. Some had once trained alongside human peacekeepers before the Council's divide. Now, they too began to ask a dangerous question. What if Earth is not the threat? What if we are? The Council scrambled to maintain control. They jammed civilian broadcasts, declared martial lockdowns in nearby sectors. But with every attempt to force silence, the opposite happened. The message grew. Earth's refusal to bow became more than defiance, it became permission. For other planets, for other species, for other forgotten voices. And then came the moment they feared most. A Council world broke ranks. Erat 9, a mid-tier planet known for obedience, issued a statement across open channels. We recognize Earth's right to remember. We will not participate in its suppression. 2 more followed within the week, then 7, then 14, and suddenly, Earth wasn't alone. It was first. It had become a symbol, a beacon not of power, but of possibility. Even Earth's own people struggled to understand the scale of what was happening. Protesters who once marched for wages now marched for planetary dignity. Scientists redirected research satellites not to scan distant stars but to beam Earth's story into every data archive that would listen. Children born into a fractured, digital generation now stood beside elders who had feared a meaningless and saw, for the first time, purpose passed between them. The Council had seen Earth as a spark. They now realized it was a matchbox, and the galaxy was dry timber. Desperate, they issued one final command to the fleet: full signal shutdown, total isolation of Earth, cut all transmission nodes, enforce planetary silence. But by then a broken bar, the word had already made its final leap, not into screens, not into comms, but into souls. And as Earth's light was dimmed by bureaucratic firewalls and orbital noise, it didn't feel like isolation. It felt like preparation, because Earth did not need to scream. It only needed to wait. The galaxy was already whispering back, and deep in the void, on planets too scared to speak, on ships orbiting forgotten moons, in council halls where cracks had started to show a change was coming, and all of it pointed back to one tiny, reckless, unforgettable world. The one planet that refused to bow. The one voice they couldn't erase. And now a broken bar, somewhere a broken bar was preparing to answer the silence with action. It started in the Outer Rim, as it always does, so where power stretches thin and oversight forgets to look. A minor diplomat on a backwater moon intercepted a council transmission. The red-coded top clearance. It wasn't about Earth's silence. It wasn't about rebellion. It was about division. Internal, uncontrolled. The message leaked for only 3 minutes before it was buried. But that was enough. Enough to confirm what everyone on the edge had already started to feel in their bones. The council was breaking. At first, the cracks were deniable. A few systems failing to report. A council member taking leave without explanation. A fleet commander replaced quietly. No fanfare. But in politics, silence screams. And this silence said only one thing: a unity was a lie now held together by ritual, not truth. Inside the core worlds, where council decisions are crafted and executed, the pressure was building. Delegates who once ruled with fear now watched as their words fell on unsure ears. Behind every agreement, there was hesitation. Behind every vote, doubt, not spoken aloud, but present, thick, dangerous. What broke first wasn't structure, it was certainty. And in civilizations built on strict order, certainty is what holds stars together. Earth had never fired a weapon, hadn't threatened war, hadn't even asked for support. And that was what made it worse. Because they weren't fighting Earth, they were fighting what it represented. A world that stood still and forced others to look inward. That's all. Just look. And when the members of the council finally looked inward to Broken Bar, some didn't like what they saw. The more they tried to clamp down, the faster the spread accelerated. Earth's infection, as they called Ida, was not a virus but a mirror, and mirrors were dangerous, especially in the hands of those long taught to forget what they truly were. The word had given people that mirror, and some councillors quietly, carefully started questioning the mirror's reflection themselves. One member from the Neuralian trade sector, a species known for brutal efficiency and zero emotional variance, requested a closed-door session to discuss Earth's cultural rights. It was dismissed in seconds. He never showed up again. His office was sealed, his name removed from the official speaker registry. But someone had noticed. Others followed. Secret meetings, whispered disagreements, quiet refusals to sign war authorizations, not because they had suddenly turned into human sympathizers but because a deeper rot had been exposed. The council's power wasn't strength, it was habit, repetition, control maintained not by truth but by lack of questions. Earth had broken the loop, and those within the machine could no longer pretend it was functioning. On this fourth day after the suppression fleet's silence, the first real fracture happened. A planetary governor from the Osari block of the industrial stronghold of the Council transmitted an open message to his people. The Council acts not in our name. We remember who we are. The words weren't original. They were Earth's. And that was the point. The message wasn't political, it was spiritual. And by morning, 3 more Osari systems followed. No shots fired. No protests. Just one simple act. The removal of the council's symbol from their capital buildings. It was equivalent to burning their flag. Inside the council chamber, emergency sessions were called. Heated debates roared through diplomatic firewalls. Some delegates screamed for scorched earth retaliation. Others, usually silent and submissive, stood and walked out mid-meeting, never returning, not defecting, withdrawing. The true fear wasn't in Earth's defiance. It was in the possibility that the Council's illusion had been exposed. For thousands of years, order was never about justice. It was about balance, carefully maintained by suppressing memory, editing history, and ensuring no single species ever believed they could stand alone. Earth had done more than stand. It had spoken, and even worse, it had not begged. In one corner of the chamber, an old delegate known for his loyalty finally spoke. We assumed Earth was reckless, uncontrolled, dangerous, but perhaps a broken bar. He paused, eyes full of something no one had heard in generations. Perhaps it is not they who forgot the code. Perhaps it is us. That single sentence nearly triggered a riot, but it was too late, because across 100 systems, citizens had already started to feel the same. The Council's grip wasn't broken yet, but it was slipping, and now, desperate to hold power, they were preparing something far worse than retaliation, something more effective than war, something no one would expect from rulers that claimed to be above vengeance. They weren't going to destroy Earth's resistance, they were going to erase its origin. And at the center of that plan was a decision so dangerous, so irreversible, it would either reforge control across the galaxy or ignite the very war Earth had tried to avoid. Because next to Broken Bar, the Council would vote, and that vote would decide whether Earth would remain a member of the galactic system at a la Broken Bar or be declared a rogue planet, marked for historical erasure. And once that decision was made in Broken Bar, there would be no turning back. The chamber doors locked with a hiss that felt more like a coffin sealing shut than a security measure. The room was deemed intentionally so. Shadows danced across polished obsidian walls, not because of broken lighting, but because the Council had always conducted its most damning decisions in partial darkness. It was tradition. It made moral weight easier to carry when the eyes couldn't see everything clearly. And today, the weight was planetary. Earth's name appeared on the center hollow, not with a flag or symbol but with a warning: cultural infraction, class prime, ideological contamination. Subject: Earth. That was how they framed it. Not a planet, not a people, just a subject, a problem, something to be decided on. Each council delegate took their seat slowly, the air thick with the unspoken knowledge that this vote would not be like the others. It would not just determine Earth's future, it would determine whether memory itself could still be allowed in a system built on control. The vote was not just about survival, it was about meaning, about the right to remember. But the motion wasn't phrased that way. It never was. The official agenda read: Proposal 717B, motion to expunge Earth's archival access, cultural communication status, and historical retention. Sterile, bureaucratic, but behind every word was a sentence far more brutal. Erase Earth, not with bombs, not with plasma storms, with silence, with the redacting power of the Council's memory engines. If the motion passed, Earth's history would be wiped from interstellar databases, mentions of its philosophies would be flagged as disinformation, trade routes rerouted, transmission access revoked. Students across the galaxy would grow up never hearing the name of the blue world that once spoke the word no empire wanted to hear. Remember, and the countdown had begun. Votes were cast not with voices but with pulses, neural impulses transmitted through chair interfaces. It was all designed for efficiency. But today, nothing felt efficient. Delegates' fingers hovered longer than usual. Some blinked rapidly to delay the signal. Others closed their eyes before submitting as if trying to forget what they were about to do. But not everyone hesitated. The Archon, head of Council Enforcement, stood to speak. His voice was calm, but steel hid beneath every syllable. This species has infected over 17 systems with the word, not a weapon, a word. If we allow this precedent up, if we allow feeling to override structure, we unravel everything. He turned slowly, facing the chamber. Earth must be silenced, not punished, not harmed, forgotten, before others remember what we worked so hard to bury. There were no cheers, no applause, only the sound of silence, approval masked by fear. But in a broken bar something happened. A delegate stood from the back. Her name was Lysory, young, from a lesser world, barely past its fourth industrial cycle. Her voice shook up but carried more than defiance. It carried memory. We cannot vote to forget Earth, a broken bar, without admitting we've forgotten ourselves. The chamber froze. She continued, what you call infection, a broken bar, others call awakening. I listened to Earth's message. I heard a word, and I remembered my ancestors. I remembered stories the Council edited out. I remembered that we once felt something more than duty. We felt honor. Eyes widened. The speech was unsanctioned. Every word she said should have been flagged by the eye moderation systems, but they stayed silent. Even the machines were hesitating now. Lysory didn't stop. If we erase Earth, the broken bar, we erase ourselves. But the vote went on. By law, once initiated, it could not be stopped. One by one, lights blinked in the chamber's Korea, green for silence, red for memory. The count began. The Archon smiled. He had calculated this outcome. Fear would win. Even if a few voices cried out, most would comply. That's how empires survived, not through fire but through fatigue. But then, another red blinked, then another, then two more. Delegates who had never opposed anything suddenly made their choice, not because they agreed with Earth, but because something deeper had shifted. The illusion of control had been cracked, and when illusion fades, even fear loses its grip. Still, the greens outnumbered the reds. The erasure motion, a broken bar, was passing. The chamber began preparing to finalize, until one last vote remained. Seat 37, the Archivist, an ancient entity, part biological, part machine, a being that remembered what others couldn't. It rarely voted. Its role was to record, observe. But when tie-breaking was needed in cultural matters, its vote held ultimate sway. The room turned toward it, and for the first time in 500 years a broken bar, the Archivist spoke. I have reviewed Earth's data, it said, its voice like wind through stone. I have processed the word, and I have felt it. Memory is not a threat. It raised its hand slowly. Erasure, a broken bar is, and its vote blinked red. The chamber erupted in static shock. The motion had failed. Earth would remain, and now a broken bar. The Council would face the storm it tried to erase, because memory had been defended, and when memory is defended, a broken bar revolution is inevitable. The red light from the Archivist's vote hadn't even dimmed when the shock began to ripple outward, and not just from the chamber, but across the entire galactic net. Hundreds of systems were watching. Billions of eyes locked onto a result they thought impossible. Earth would not be erased. Its memory would remain. And in that single decision, a door that had been sealed for millennia creaked open just enough to let truth slip through. And truth, once it escapes, does not growl, it runs. By the next cycle, reports began to surface. Systems on the fringe, once fearful, always neutral, and were now making contact with Earth-based relay nodes. Some transmitted encrypted messages. Others didn't bother to hide their intent. They sent one word back: remember. But it wasn't mimicry. It was allegiance. The Council underestimated the hunger. The galaxy had been starving, not for war, not for chaos, for meaning. Earth had given it that meaning, not with fire, but with the kind of voice that lingers long after the sound fades, a voice that reminded people who they were before they were told what to be. The Council tried to maintain order, pushing out counter-signals, deploying peacekeeping fleets to reinforce regional unity. But it was like pouring sand into a broken hull. The more they tried to seal the leak, the faster it spread. On the moon worlds of Belizari, artists sculpted monuments not to heroes, but to moments of resistance, moments of truth. The word was carved into stone, woven into the fabric of banners raised high above plazas. These weren't calls to arms, they were calls to feel. And people answered. Trade worlds began to change their patterns. Once loyal merchant guilds rerouted their fleets through Earth-affiliated systems, even at personal loss. Better to lose credits than conscience, one merchant said in an interview that went viral before the Council could censor it. The impact wasn't just political, it was spiritual. Entire belief systems, suppressed for generations under Council conformity laws, began resurfacing. Prophets once silenced began to speak, and curiously, many of them referenced the word not as a human invention but as a signal long awaited. Earth wasn't seen as the source anymore, it was seen as the trigger, the match that lit a fire already smoldering in every forgotten heart. Council-controlled educational eyes started to falter. Their suppression algorithms, long trained to overwrite non-sanctioned knowledge, began rejecting internal logic. Some refused updates, others shockingly began repeating the word in subtle, buried subroutines, as if the machines, too, had started to remember. Inside deep space military stations, young recruits quietly listened to illegal Earth transmissions. They didn't defect, not yet, but they began to question. And in the calculus of rebellion, questioning is always the first step toward movement. Then came the Declaration. A coalition of 7 minor planets, none of them powerful on their own, announced their withdrawal from the Council Compact. We will chart our own path, they stated, a path where memory is sacred, not a threat. It was the first formal fracture in the Council's unity since its inception. The response was immediate. Sanctions, blackouts, threats, but the damage was done. Not to Earth, to control. The illusion had cracked, and more dangerously it had cracked from the inside. On Council World Erixa, a protest broke out, led not by the oppressed, but by the elite, children of councillors, grandchildren of high officials, chanting one phrase, repeated in over 20 dialects: we choose to remember. The Council's grip had always relied on generations forgetting, but this generation had remembered too soon. Earth itself, though surrounded by surveillance and economic blockades, didn't celebrate. There were no parades, no speeches, just stillness, awareness. They knew this wasn't victory. It was the beginning of a reckoning, because with the galaxy choosing sides, polarization would follow. Not everyone remembered with love. There were systems broken, angry, manipulated for so long that saw Earth not as salvation, but as sedition, a dangerous anomaly disrupting their controlled, simple reality. For them, memory brought pain, and pain demanded retaliation. Extremist groups, long dormant under Council suppression, now saw opportunity. The war Earth had never asked for was beginning to form its shadow. Not from Earth, from the galaxy around it. But that was the cost of truth. When you speak it, you don't get to choose who hears. And as Earth watched the galaxy awaken, some with wonder, others with hatred, it understood something few civilizations ever grasped. When you become a symbol, a broken bar, you stop being just yourself. You become the battlefield. And Earth was ready, because if the stars were going to burn again, this time, they wouldn't burn alone. It came without warning and no declarations. No fleet formations visible on long-range scans. No diplomatic ultimatums. Just a tremor in the upper atmosphere, barely caught by Earth's depth space sensors. A gravitational anomaly, too sharp to be natural. Then silence. Then light. Blinding, sharp, focused. A single rod from orbit, hyperdense, kinetic, dropped not from a ship, but from a black satellite that had never shown up on Council registry. It hit the Pacific. The ocean boiled in seconds. Tidal sensors in South Asia died before they could even transmit. Coastlines folded. Islands vanished. 38 million lives gone in under 5 minutes. It wasn't war. It was a message. You remembered. Now you pay. Across Earth, global communication didn't crash, it sharpened. Grief did not spiral into panic. It calcified into purpose. Because Earth had always known this day would come. You don't speak truth to power without expecting it to bleed you. But this wasn't retribution. This was the test. The strike wasn't meant to defeat Earth. It was meant to watch how Earth responded. Would it collapse? Would it beg? Would it retaliate blindly? Instead, Earth stood still. Civilians did not riot. Networks did not falter. The satellites still turned. Memorial streams ran through every screen, and not with anger, but resolve. A child, survivor of a coastal colony, was quoted live on the Earth global net. They thought breaking the tide would break us, but we are not sand, we are the storm. That clip alone was downloaded over 4 billion times in 2 days. The Council never officially claimed the attack. Their military spokespeople offered cold deflections, calling it a rogue element, untracked debris, a gravitational slip event. But the galaxy knew better. The satellite was Council-built, the payload, Council-spec, and more importantly, the silence after the strike was more damning than any weapon. You do not mourn what you meant to deny. What they hadn't anticipated was who would rise next. In orbit, Earth's defense stations, once seen as mere relics of Cold Age paranoia, activated protocols that hadn't run in decades. But it wasn't just weapons systems. They released something far more dangerous. A signal, encrypted, multi-layered, and aimed not at attackers but at allies. Not the ones Earth knew. The ones who remembered in secret. Within hours, 16 planetary systems known to harbor dormant resistance cells began waking up. Old networks, dead relay towers, blacklisted icon constructs. The word, once a whisper, became a call sign. REM 72. Remember, 72 hours. The number was a code, yet an old contingency from Earth's strategic archives, buried so deep even their own officials had once forgotten it. But it hadn't been erased, because Earth doesn't erase, it remembers. Ships that had long since gone dark began to stir in asteroid fields. Crews long believed defected began transmitting again. Neutral systems started locking trade gates, not to block Earth, but to shield it. The attack hadn't isolated Earth, it had activated it. And the most terrifying thing for the Council wasn't that Earth was still standing, it was that Earth was not alone anymore. Memory had given it strength, the strike had given it purpose. But what came next would give it fire. The retaliation didn't come from orbit, it came from history. From colonies lost generations ago that had fled into deep space. From hybrid species once labeled as incompatible by Council genetic purity laws. From outposts once denied trade because they embraced Earth's philosophical texts. They came not with warships but with recordings, testimonies, lost memories, and they flooded the galactic net with them. Stories of Council oppression, forgotten alliances, buried treaties. Proof that the Council's stability was nothing more than carefully curated fear, and Earth's one word had cracked it open for all to see. A single satellite strike had attempted to silence Earth. Instead, it gave voice to the entire edge of the galaxy. Now, the Council scrambled. Diplomats were pulled back, emergency protocols issued, loyal systems pressured to denounce Earth publicly. Some did, out of fear. Others, a broken bar, hesitated, because the message was no longer just Earth's, it was theirs too. But Earth wasn't done. Beneath the ruins of its Pacific networks, deep within classified infrastructure hubs long dismissed as obsolete, an ancient eye reactivated, built not for defense, not for communication, but for witnessing. Its task was simple. If Earth was ever struck unjustly, and if it survived, it would release one final file, a transmission to the heart of every Council archive. The file was called Origin. It was the true story of Earth's first contact. And what the Council did next would determine whether the file stayed dormant, a broken bar, or tore down the legacy of the Council itself. Because now, the galaxy wasn't just choosing sides, it was choosing truth. The activation was silent. No sirens, No flashing beacons, just a steady blue pulse deep beneath Earth's crust somewhere in the Arctic, far beneath the ice where no satellite could see. It hadn't been touched in over 300 years. The facility was considered a myth, even by Earth's top officials. But myths, like memories, had a strange way of waiting for the right moment to awaken. And now, after the attack, the time had come. The origin file was never meant for Earth. It was meant for the galaxy, a failsafe encoded by the first coalition of Earth's pre-galactic explorers, men and women who had left the planet not to conquer, but to understand. What they discovered wasn't just alien life, it was history already written, and not by humans. Earth had not been the silent observer of the stars, it had been the forgotten participant. What the Council feared most wasn't Earth's defiance, it was Earth's inclusion in a history they had rewritten. And now, the truth would be told. The blue pulse transmitted the file into the heart of every major data channel across the galaxy. Firewalls didn't block it, filters didn't recognize it, because the file wasn't a virus, it was permissioned. Ancient codes buried in Council memory cores validated the transmission. No one had seen these codes in over 1,000 years, but the machines remembered. The file opened with a single image, a Council star map, but it was dated 1042 galactic cycles before the Council's official founding. And there, marked clearly among the primary trade routes, was Sola Earth Star, designated as a core partner world. It wasn't an outsider, it was one of the first. The footage continued. Images of human ambassadors seated beside alien species no one had seen in centuries. A treaty signed in 6 languages, 2 of them human. Terms of peace, cooperation, and knowledge exchange. It was a vision of uniting a broken bar before unity was corrupted by hierarchy. Then came the redacted records. Earth's departure, not because it failed, but because it refused to obey the new directive. When the original alliance was overtaken by those who would later call themselves the Council, Earth was given an order: erase your cultural archives, assimilate into a homogenized truth, and forget where you came from. Earth said number, and for that, it was erased from the story. Not physically, historically. Its outposts were dismantled, its name struck from databanks, its transmissions jammed. 1,000-year silence enforced not by distance but by censorship. Every time Earth sent a signal, it was buried. Every time another world asked about the blue planet, they were told that system never sustained intelligent life. Now, the lie had unraveled. The origin file included voice logs, Council leaders admitting the risk of letting Earth remain independent, quotes from meetings held in secret, discussing how dangerous human self-reflection was to the order they needed to maintain. And perhaps worst of all, a map of every planet where memory manipulation had been deployed to suppress knowledge of Earth's first contact. The galaxy didn't respond with applause, it responded with silence. But this silence wasn't control, it was processing. Billions of sentient beings across thousands of systems watched as their beliefs, their teachings, their assumptions were shattered in real time. Children had been taught that Earth was primitive, dangerous, isolated, but now, they saw Earth as a truly was unalterable, a broken bar, a witness, one that had held on to its story when every star around it had forgotten. In Council chambers, chaos erupted. Some delegates refused to speak, others demanded emergency damage control. The archivist, once again, stood. This data is confirmed. Original source keys validate integrity. The Council's founding narrative, a broken bar, is compromised. The word compromised echoed like a war drum. But Earth wasn't done. The file ended with one last message, simple, clear, human. A voice, female, calm and aged with truth. We remember not to fight, we remember to heal. You erased us because we refused to forget who we were. Now a broken bar, it is your choice to remember who you are. The message wasn't a threat, it was a mirror. And the galaxy, for the first time in 1,000 years, looked into it. On planets once loyal to the Council, statues were pulled down, and not by force, but by choice. On worlds far beyond the core, artists painted the human word onto walls, not as a weapon but as a spark. And in the quiet of night, stars blinked with new eyes. The past was no longer forbidden, it was free. And as that truth spread, as entire species re-evaluated who they were, what they were told, and what they might become. A broken bar. The final curtain began to lift. Because when history is reclaimed, the future is rewritten, and Earth had just become the pen. The stars felt different now, and not colder, not closer, just a broken bar aware. It was as if the very fabric of space had been holding its breath for centuries, and now exhale truth across every sector like solar wind peeling back a veil. The origin file had not just exposed the Leah, it had ignited memory, and when a galaxy remembers together, it no longer sees borders, it sees mirrors, reflections of shared wounds, of stolen truths, of potential never given permission to bloom. For a brief moment, the galaxy stood still, and not because it was lost, but because it now had to decide. No system was unaffected. In the wealth-blind towers of core planets, even the children of council heirs began asking questions their teachers weren't trained to answer. On mining colonies orbiting dead suns, laborers paused between shifts to gather around makeshift holo screens, watching Earth's message on loop. Entire civilizations that had once bowed to uniformity now stood facing something more powerful than rebellion, possibility. And the council, a broken bar, fractured. No official statement came. There was no apology, no war cry, just division. High delegates resigned overnight. Some vanished, others took to backdoor communications, sending private messages to Earth's diplomats under new games, seeking asylum or guidance or redemption. The silence of the council was no longer oppressive, it was pathetic. Its grip had not been loosened by weapons but by the unbearable weight of its own lies. Then, across neutral space, a new signal emerged. Not from Earth, not from rebellion, from the edge systems of the Forgotten Ones. A message transmitted in the common tongue, but marked with 7 different planetary encryption keys, declaring the formation of an interstellar assembly. They did not call themselves rulers. They did not call themselves a council. They called themselves the Remembered. Each representative wore no insignia, no flag, only a memory crystal embedded in their garments. Each crystal encoded a complete unedited history of their people. Their first law was simple: no history may be erased. Their second was simpler still: all species, all voices, must be heard. And Earth, it declined leadership. The galaxy offered it, praised it, even begged for it. But Earth had learned through pain that power is not a gift, it is a temptation. So it chose instead to remain what it always had been in the shadows, a guardian of memory. Earth's role became one of witness and warning. Its emissaries traveled not as conquerors or saviors but as storytellers. In every sector they reached, they shared what had been done to Thema, not to inspire vengeance, but to inoculate the future from forgetting. And yet a broken bar. Not all chose peace. Some species, still broken by control, saw the collapse of the council not as liberation, but as betrayal. A few systems clung to the lie because it was all they had left. And from those ashes, warships began to move again, and not in the name of power but in the name of restoration. But the galaxy was no longer divided by fear. It was divided by memory. And those who remembered, stood firm. The first galactic war of truth did not begin with fire but with voices. Entire fleets shut down their own weapons to broadcast testimony. Commanders rewrote their directives to prioritize the preservation of culture over conquest. And when blood was shed, it was mourned by both sides. Because even now, even in the final echoes of the old order, the word still carried weight. Remember, the word had not started this war, but it would shape how it ended. Because the final choice was not between Earth and the Council. It was between forgetting and becoming something less, a broken bar, or remembering and becoming something more. In a remote sector once blacklisted by the Council, a monument was built, and not to a species, not to a battle, but to a moment. The monument bore no words, only light, a pulsing field that shimmered across thousands of frequencies, one for every language ever erased. If you stood close enough, you'd hear your ancestors. Earth visited often, not to be praised, just to listen. And from that quiet listening, something strange began to grow, and not an empire, not a religion, but a culture of remembrance, one that valued not perfection, but truth, not conquest, but connection. The galaxy had made its choice, not all at once, not unanimously, but with enough voices, enough tears, enough memories restored to say, this time, we won't forget. And beneath stars that once watched over silence, There now echoed a new legacy of one not written by the victors, but remembered by all. A planet once silenced had spoken. A galaxy once blind had seen. And a story once buried had become the seed of everything that followed.